Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to another paranormal pop culture chat with denofgeek.com, hosted by yours truly. I am Aaron Sagers, a journalist, author, currently seen on Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus. We have a new fifth season just around the corner, but that's not what we're nerding out about today. In fact, today, what we're nerding about in the new movie, Spider Man No Way Home, which looks to be perhaps as eagerly anticipated as Avengers Endgame, or at least potentially as financially successful. In No Way Home, Peter Parker's identity has been revealed, and he goes to the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange, for help. But when that spell goes wrong, dangerous foes from other worlds start to appear, forcing Peter to discover what it truly means to be Spider-Man. Now, of course, Loki already toyed with the idea of the multiverse, but this new movie blows wide open this concept within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's going to be further explored in the 2022 movie Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. In fact, I think that's exactly going to be coming out 5 months from now. So, what if the multiverse is real? What if there are all of these parallel dimensions and versions of ourselves out there? Speaking of which, I was going to wear a Spider-Man multiverse shirt, but I think it's in the wash. At least it's in the wash in this timeline, in this dimension. Maybe another version of me has it, but I do have my Spider-Man mug. So I do not have a Sorcerer Supreme on hand, but I have something that, dare I say, is even better. I have a Wizard of Weirdness. John EL Tenney is a well-recognized, and if I do say so myself, I would say that he is a sought-after investigator of all kinds of weirdness, UFO, paranormal, occult phenomena. Tenney has been involved in the field of paranormal research for more than 3 decades, and more than 1,000 people have attended one of his signature weird lectures throughout the years. No doubt you have seen him. He's performed as a consultant on numerous programs with NBC, A&E, Sci-Fi, Fox. He has appeared on television shows including Unsolved Mysteries, Sightings, Paranormal State, Ghost Stalkers, Paranormal Lockdown, Hellier, and Kindred Spirits. And also, he's a friend of mine. He's a buddy. He's one of the most knowledgeable nerds I know. And without further ado, I want to bring John Tenney into the chat. Tenney,
There I am.
here you are. Thanks for joining today out of your weird schedule, and also in between two naps of yours, right?
Yes, maybe three, depending on which universe I'm kind of in. But no, talking about comic books and weirdness, that's my game. I'm ready to go.
And I'm ready to have you here. We already have folks tuning in. We've got folks from Austin. Hey there, Beach Bum ATX, Houston, couple Texans in the house, and Cedar Rapids, Jammer J, and a couple Minnesota, Winter Garden, Florida, and also our friend Alfonso from New York City. He's here as well. So okay, let's get into it. Oh, okay, what is based on your definition, the way you view it, when we use the word multiverse, when we throw around the idea of parallel universes, how do you define it? How do you approach it from a starting point?
Well, it's strange, right? Because we have these words these ideas like parallel dimensions and multiverses and omniverses and megaverses, and we throw them around as if they are interchangeable, but technically they really aren't. So when you hear people talking about there being multiple dimensions, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are multiple realities. You know, a dimension, the one that we live in, seems to have three and possibly a fourth if you count time. And a dimension is just a way to experience the universe that you are currently in. So a single universe can have multiple dimensions, but those dimensions don't necessarily have a universe attached to them aside from this one we live in. So that's one of the ideas that I really love to think about, is when there do become parallel realities, when there become a multiverse, when it becomes a megaverse, an dimensional property to them. And this isn't, at least for me as a researcher of paranormal and high strangeness phenomena, it's not such a strange idea, because it's an idea that's been around for as long as humans have tried to put stories down on paper or on papyrus, or pressed into clay blocks. We've always talked about things like heaven and hell, and those are separate realities from this reality. An afterlife is another existence, another world of existence. So whether you want to go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh or even the Bible, you already see the ideas of multiverses entering human folklore and storytelling.
Yeah, and within myth and fiction, this idea of there being these overlapping worlds, it has been present for a long time. I mean, and actually, so, I even think within the nerd realm, it's already somewhat present within comic book movies and comic books. When we talk about Asgard and we talk about Thor and the nine realms of Norse mythology, I mean, those are essentially branches of the is it, yeah, Yggdrasil? What's
Yeah,
um
the world tree.
the world tree? Yeah. So there's Asgard here, Midgard there. We have Helm, or Helheim, and Jotunheim. So that what other
Well,
kind of?
and
Oh,
then
go ahead.
that's where it gets wonky, right? Because those realms exist within the single tree, right? So that's what I'm
Mhm.
kind of saying. Like, there can be multiple places that all exist within a universe. When you start to get separate universes, so this, when you go back to fiction writing, you can go back to the turn of the century, when you started having the origins of kind of weird fiction, right? And you
Mhm.
start talking about like the ancient elder gods that sleep in slumber beyond the stars in a different universe. So like, stretching that far back, or even in the 1950s, when you start to have science fiction really taking that helm, with somebody like Isaac Asimov writing The End of Eternity, which is about people who not only exist in time, but when they change time, they create a branch reality and a branch universe that becomes something else. And that's in the 50s. And you see comic books really grabbing hold of that in the 1960s and 70s, when you have Ditko coming up with Doctor Strange, and you have, Kirby going crazy with Celestials and Eternals, and let's make comic books as crazy as they should be. And I think that's the really wonderful world that we live in now, where you do have shows like Loki and WandaVision, and they're all
Mhm.
explaining all of these different possibilities. Is reality physically changed? Are there dimensions that are physical? What are the ones that are created by the conscious mind, by the experiencer? Can you experience someone else's reality? These are really deep, interesting philosophical questions. And of course, the nerds got to it first.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm going to circle back to some of the pop culture stuff in a minute, but the idea of a multiverse, or the word itself, was coined in, well, it was used, applied to what we view as essentially the multiverse, in 1952, and then first used in fiction in 1963. Michael Moorcock was the first one to use it in the Sundered Worlds. So the I want to what other kind of folklore that you can think of, myth and folklore, was this really a was really present in? Okay, so you view sort of the Asgardian, the Norse mythology, as one tree, one universe with different sort of realms, different, I guess, dimensions. What other folklore kind of leaned more into the idea of multiple overlapping universes? I believe it's present in Hindu cosmology, correct?
For sure. And, most commonly, you see coming from a more kind of Eurocentric idea of it, you'll find that stories of the Fae folk and fairy tales are always talking about a separate realm, right? Like, you can go into this mountain, but you're not really inside the mountain. You enter a fairyland. and time works differently, and you might only be in there for 4 minutes, but when you come back out, it's been 400 years and everyone that you know has passed away, which is crazy to think that they're talking about, time dilation and the way that scientists speak about going the speed of light, and you come back and everybody's older, but you're the same age. But these are being told in fairy tales in the 1600s about the fae folk and the fairies. So you do see it overlap a lot. And again, if you go back to fiction writing, I've always thought that fiction writers, comic book authors, artists in general are much better predictors at what the universe might be, because they're allowed to be creative when thinking about it. And I think the universe is creative in the way that it does things. And so you see a lot of glimpses, probably the things that spark scientists into thinking deeper about reality after reading fiction or comic books.
And yeah, I know we've talked a little bit about that before. I mean, the as far as creatives, authors kind of tapping into something that is true, something that is intrinsically true. I will note that I am doing this from my place in Brooklyn, New York, so there might be some background noise coming in from this universe of traffic. I'm pretty certain it's this universe's traffic that people might be able to hear the cars honking. Yeah, I mentioned the Hindu idea because I guess the I get it. I can never say it. Bhagavad. What is it? Say it for me.
Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah.
That's a
Well,
close
and then specifically,
approximation. Yeah.
yeah, and the Purana, like they talk about the 7 layers of universes, but also that there are multiple universes crossing over with one another, and within the idea of quantum physics, and within the people that are studying, scientists that study the Big Bang Theory, it's kind of close to that, because they talk at times about these bubbles that touch on one another. And then you even mentioned sort of time dilation that is borne out in the idea that as you're actually entering these bubbles, or if we cross over into another bubble, by the time we could possibly get there, time has already shifted on our end, correct?
Yeah, and what's interesting when you talk about that, so a few years ago, I say a few years ago, but it was probably 15 years ago now, but when people started to really toy around with the idea of supersymmetry and come up with things like superstring theory, which was a unified theory of how the universe might work. And the idea was, okay, so let's say there's going to be right now, again, like I said, we live in a 3-dimensional universe, maybe 4 with time. And when you start to apply theoretical physics to it, you start to say, okay, well, maybe there's 6. And then they got to a point where they were like, okay, so maybe supersymmetry, you have 26 dimensions. Mm-hmm. And that got even too overwhelming for physicists at the time, and they cut it back to about 10. But what's interesting with that, and something that doesn't get spoken a lot about in science, is even when you cut back to 10 dimensions in this universe, that means that there is a way in those 10 dimensions to perceive a separate reality. So that other reality in those 10 dimensions has 10 dimensions of its own, which has another reality in it. And so you immediately pop back to there being an infinite amount of worlds and an infinite amount of possibilities. And the great thing about comic books, the thing that always has blown my mind, even as a kid, is you're reading in this reality a comic book of this made-up hero, and comic book authors obviously want it to seem like it's in this world, so they put real people into the comic books that you're reading. So you're in one reality reading about another reality with a person who exists in this one. So comic books are wonky to begin with. I love it.
Yeah, and then I forget when it first happened, but the idea of not even breaking the fourth wall of the comic, but the incorporating, yes, the comic book reader within the comic. And I forget when it was, but it was like when it would show that there was some sort of blank page, or you would see the writer's pen on the page. I guess that is sort of technically breaking the fourth wall, but when they would bring us into it, they were essentially welcoming us into this multiverse.
Well, yeah, and there's an issue of Spider-Man. It's the king-sized annual 14, I think, from 1980, where Peter Parker goes to a nightclub, And there's a band performing on stage, which is called, the band is called Shrapnel. Shrapnel is actually Dave Windorf's band before he formed Monster Magnet. So you have Peter going to a club and there's a real band playing in the club. At that time, you could have gone and seen that band at that club, even though you had just read about it in this fictional comic book. Or the fact that Daredevil, one of Daredevil's fighting partners in an episode, an issue of Daredevil, is Uri Geller. They
Oh
fight
yeah.
they fight the psychic mind wave. So you have, a paranormal, quote unquote, allegedly paranormal person fighting alongside a completely fictional Daredevil in a comic book, but that guy's a real guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I guess they're constantly were pulling in. It was sort of a stunt casting for comic books, but whether it's Muhammad Ali or Uri Geller, or like constantly pulling in real people and altering them somewhat for them to exist in that realm. The For you, this idea of these branches on the tree or other universes, how does it relate to your specific paranormal research? And I want to start kind of with the notion of ghosts. Like what, how does that fit into it? Because, the idea of, oh, it's just the dead lingering around or coming back to visit from another place, that's only one element of what we think about ghosts, right? I'm
Yeah,
kind of leading up here, but I know where I'm going.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that as a paranormal researcher, I'm looking for any explanation, and I don't limit my explanations and ideas about things like ghosts. And if a ghost is just simply a kind of translucent version of you after you die that hangs around here, that ghost exists in this dimension. We somehow perceive it, it's here, it's in this reality with us. The question becomes, are all ghosts like that? Are there ghosts that are different? There seem to be some ghosts that go somewhere else and have accessibility to information that we don't have. Now that's a separate reality. So then you have, a multiverse starting to be created where you have a universe populated by those spirits or people who have passed on. And then does that universe itself have a population of its own that was never human? And how does that interact with us? And do we perceive those never human elements from that universe, if they can cross over here? Do we perceive them as ghosts? Do we perceive them as monsters? Do we see them as UFOs? Do we see them as Bigfoot? The universe that we can't perceive that they might exist within becomes infinitely weird, in the sense that we have only our biological and scientific ideas of this universe to judge other universes, possible universes. And so when you start to think about ghosts as something more than just an invisible kind of translucent version of yourself that can walk through walls, the questions start to get very deep, very quickly, and very strange.
And even if a ghost is the someone who has died in this timeline's past, and is somehow coming back to visit, then that would essentially make them, even if they were coming from quote unquote an afterlife, a heaven or whatever, even that would make them something of a interdimensional traveler, would you say?
Yeah, an interdimensional traveler, perhaps an infinite or a multi-universal traveler. It would really make you a superhero. I mean, if you die and you gain the ability to walk through walls and become translucent and speak to people telepathically and move objects with your mind, I mean, you've just become a great superhero when you die. So there's
Yeah.
that aspect on top of it, and not only being able to traverse time and space and perhaps multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I guess we have Dead Man, he's out
Right.
there doing that. But and let me remind people in the audience, you can ask some questions. We've got lots of folks that are throwing that out there. And I'll get to those momentarily. But so this notion of sticking with ghosts for a bit, and I like to think anymore that using ghosts is sort of, it's an umbrella label for me, because I think there's a lot of things that fit within that. And well, first off, do you find that when you take this approach to a ghost could be all these different types of phenomena, do you find that people are willing to buy into it a little bit more, a little bit more willing to embrace it as opposed to just, dead Aunt Sally that's popping back in for a chat? Or
So,
does this push them too far away?
I think that with a lot of people, you have to start slow. You can't go full on 100% weird with a lot of people because their ideas have been constructed according to their personal belief systems throughout the course of their life. And so they think that a ghost is just the returning spirit of a loved one. And in some cases, it might just be that. But to immediately throw people into, well, your loved one might have become an interdimensional time traveler with massive superpowers might be a little too far for some people. But the thing is, doing what paranormal investigators do when you do these things called, EVP experiments, when you're trying to record ghostly voices, I will ask questions. A lot of times, if you watch television, you watch paranormal reality shows, people will say, who are you? Can you tell me your name? Can you tell me what's wrong? My questions are always much more like, how do you experience me? How do you see me? What are you seeing right now? What is your reality like? And in those cases, when I've asked those questions and seem to have gotten responses, the answers are quite telling. I did an experiment, uh, an EVP session probably about 15 years ago, and whatever I might have been communicating with, the question was, who is there with you? And the answer that I got back was everyone. And I said, everyone how? And the response was, everyone that has ever been. And so, like, a question like that, like, now you have everyone that has ever been. Sociologists will tell you that there have been approximately 50 billion deaths on the planet since there's been human beings. So now you're talking about there's only 8 billion people on the planet right now. You have somewhere where 50 billion people are existing altogether. That's quite an amazing different experience.
Mm-hmm. And a pretty crowded room, I'm guessing. But the something that I always am fascinated about within the paranormal investigation element of it is we see a lot of people that pose questions like, how did you die? Or what did you like to do when you were alive? Posing things in past tense as opposed to the idea of maybe things are potentially existing for themselves in their own timeline. And have you experienced things? Do you think there are at times people we call ghosts or think to be ghosts that might actually be existing in their own way in a kind of a corporeal form in a just another timeline or in another universe?
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about at some of my lectures is, if you look back at traditionally well-known, allegedly haunted locations, and you look back in the diaries and the books of those locations that are said to be very haunted, a lot of the times you will see that the reports, from 100 or 150 years ago are kind of shadowy figures moving about in the darkness, speaking in low whispers, and strange lights moving around them while that's happening. Well, if you think that forward, and if you take kind of interdimensionality and universality into the equation, you have these locations that right now are being investigated by paranormal researchers who are walking around in the dark, who are speaking in low whispers, and they're holding machines with strange lights on them. Is it possible that the people who are investigating the locations current day, right now in the present, are what the people in the past are experiencing as ghosts? And so when you start to see that there might be some meld and overlap, then again, that ghostly realm becomes a lot stranger than, I think, just, dying and becoming a wispy version of yourself.
Have you personally experienced something where the notion of that ghost, well, you mentioned the EVP, but anything else where like you're encountering something that sort of breaks your brain as far as what a ghost might be, uh encountering some sort of time loop?
Yeah, one of the stories that I tell is I had a client many years ago who had gone to her grandmother's home. Her grandmother had passed away. She was going to check up on the house. Everything had been sold off and the house had been sold. She was doing the final check. And when she walked into the living room through this kind of arched foyer, she saw two little girls and an older woman. She screamed and they vanished away.
Mhm.
So she immediately called her aunt and she said, Grandma's house is haunted. And her aunt said, you're crazy. Grandma's house isn't haunted. She called her mother. Grandma's house is haunted. You're crazy. Grandma's house isn't haunted. And a couple days later, her aunt called her back and said, I don't think that Grandma's house is haunted, but I do need to tell you, years and years ago, when your mom and I were little girls, we were with Grandma in the living room, and a woman walked through the arched foyer and screamed at us, and then she vanished.
Hmm.
And it was in that moment that my client realized that she had been the ghost in the past to her mother and grandmother and aunt, and her mother, aunt, and grandmother had been the ghosts in her present. And what's even crazier is to think that her grandmother in the present is dead but alive in the past, but being experienced in the present. So not only do you have like time travel happening, but you have time traveling ghosts happening.
Yeah. And I've heard those stories before. I'm just like I'm lobbing some teeing up some good ones to get some nice
But like
raw
I
meat out of you.
but you know this, and like I just said, it's sometimes very hard to tell people like your grandma's a time traveler.
I mean, I think it would make grandma pretty cool. The what about the idea of you mentioned UFOs, and I think even we can kind of go into cryptids a little bit. This idea of interdimensionals, or the researcher John Keel, in Operation Trojan Horse, tried to connect the dots a little bit between UFOs and the supernatural. Can you go into that a little bit more about what those theories are? And I mean, is that something that you think is widely accepted by, ufologists now, researchers?
No, but I think that as people investigate and explore high strangeness and paranormal phenomenon, you are left really thinking about. I mean, a lot of people want let's study this. Let's put it under a microscope and falsify it and reproduce it and study it scientifically. And as you fall deeper down the rabbit hole, whether it be with ufology or cryptozoology or ghosts, you start to realize that there is this intangibleness to it, that there does seem to be multiple realities kind of bleeding into ours. And that sometimes, most of the time, at least I have found, it's very individualized to the experiencer, which makes it almost unstudyable by science because it doesn't become very reproducible. Now, it
Hmm.
might have some crossover, such as, but you have to find it. So, and when I mean you have to find it in the sense of, and John Keel has explored things like this, when people have Bigfoot sightings, they will tell you about the Bigfoot sighting, but they will very often leave out because they don't think it's important. They sometimes even, not remembered it until you really talk them through it. But usually, before and after people have a Bigfoot sighting, they see a green flash. And no one's ever really looked into what that flash is. Is that flash some kind of doorway opening? Is it a beam down from a ship? Like, we don't know because you're so interested in the weird experience of seeing a Bigfoot that the green flash is, kind of pawned off as nothing
Hmm.
really important. The same thing happens with UFOs. You can start to see some patterns that emerge. People who have UFO experiences, even just a random UFO sighting. People will report loud buzzing in their ears, a wobbliness to themselves. They might report seeing what seems to be a flashing red light. But those little segments kind of get parsed out because the overall experience of seeing a UFO takes the lead in the story. But when you start to add up all of these other little things, it does look like there's some kind of something that should be trackable, that seems to be a bleed through from those realms where this strange experience seems to be emanating from.
Hmm. I just want to bring this up. This is Stargazer says, I don't know if I believe that. And and that's okay, Stargazer. I think that's okay. I don't think John Tenney is going to be deeply offended by that, but I
No,
just love.
that's the thing too. And I tell people this, this, Aaron. I don't, one of the reasons that I think that I get a lot of grief sometimes from the paranormal community is because I openly tell people, like, I don't believe any of it. I think that a belief is a rooting concrete system that doesn't allow flexibility, and it doesn't allow to shape and bend and grow and evolve. I have many ideas about these things, but to say that I believe ghosts are time travelers, or to believe that Bigfoot, is from an alternate dimension, these are just ideas that I have. And anybody that tells you that they know for sure 100% and that you should believe exactly what they say, that leads down dark and dangerous roads.
Yeah, and that's something that I try to share with people as well, is like once you push into sort of the realm of ideology and belief, then you're establishing your own sets of rules about the unknown and the unexplained, and as opposed to truly remaining open-minded. And I present theories. I like to think about theories and not as if these are rules.
Well,
The
and the thing is too, is when we talk about the experience of realities and multi-dimensions and multiverses, we can have a similar, not great experience, but something similar we can think about. And I've talked about this at my lectures, and I'm very anecdotal, and I kind of tell folksy stories just to get the ideas across. I always say I'm throwing out thought seeds. But like, I have squirrels that sit on the back of my deck that I feed peanuts to every day. Now, I'm just on the other side of a glass door. That squirrel and I exist within the same reality. We exist within the same dimensions, but our experience of these dimensions in this reality are increasingly different, just because of the biological components of a
Mhm.
squirrel and what it can see and what it can experience, how I can appear and then vanish, how food can magically appear and then vanish. This all would seem very strange. And human beings, we like to think ourselves the end all be all of everything, so we've got it all explained and figured out. But the reality is, sometimes I do put down something and I go back to get it and it's gone, and a few minutes later I go back and it's exactly where it was in the first place. And so there does seem to be this weird peanut thrower and I'm the squirrel.
The I want to throw this one out there. What's your favorite book and or teaching on quantum physics? I mean, I think that's a good question, but also just overall, what are some of the you've conducted a lot of research across the decades, but what are some of the books that you enjoy, not just quantum physics, that you think could help bring people along a little bit on this weird journey or journey into weirdness?
I like Brian Greene for physics stuff. Obviously, Stephen Hawking makes things very palatable for people. When you get into paranormal stuff, Brian Greene also has a great kind of 9 types of dimensionality
Mhm.
and universes. He talks about, brain theory and inflationary theory and quilted universe. So I think that is I'm trying to remember the name of another book called The Whole Shebang is the name of the book. I can't think of the author's name right now, but I think that's kind of good to look into, kind of a cosmological framework. Also, if you want to get weird, reading things like John Keel, whether it's, even though some of his stuff is slightly wonky, uh, Jacques Vallée too, I think Passport to Magonia is a good book to get people on that track. Or even John Fraser's The Golden Bow, which is a huge collection of folkloric stories that he was compiled together. I think that when you start to think about paranormal phenomena and science, I think that you really need to have a good base in folklore, because I do think it's important. I do think that there are archetypes that repeat, not just in folklore, but actually in science. I think that when a good idea is present, it presents itself in multiple researchers. That way the universe kind of doesn't lose the idea. You can see that with the ideas that Einstein was developing, other people were developing it at the same time. Just in case anything happened to Einstein, the universe was going to make sure that there was at least one more there. But yeah, I mean, like I said, Brian Greene, John Keel, Jacques Vallée, Stephen Hawking, even Michio Kaku writing Hyperspace. That's a great book too.
Yeah, and for anyone that doesn't know out there, with John Keel, I mentioned Operation Trojan Horse, but more famously known for the Mothman prophecies, which is, that was my first exposure to Keel, I think, like a lot of people, and I still enjoy it, although some of his opinion on gender and whatnot is somewhat dated, or entirely dated. And then you mentioned Jacques Vallée and Vallée and J. Allen Hynek, which we think of more, well, within mainstream, because there was the Project Blue Book series. Hynek himself kind of moved into this idea of interdimensional theories. Correct? Correct me if I'm wrong, because didn't he write about it with Vallée?
Yes. So they wrote a book together. And I think it's interesting. So Vallée is one of kind of the old school UFO researchers, but he started off at SRI, which is a Stanford Research Institute in California back in the 1950s and 60s. And he was a computer programmer interested in UFOs, but at SRI, one of the things that he was kind of tasked with was creating a computer system that could enhance people's telepathy, if they had telepathy, enhance psychic communication. And so they actually created ARPANET, which became the internet. It was a way that they could conduct telepathic experiments from California to people in New York. And Vallée's ideas about how information is exchanged between universes really ties into a lot of his ideas about what we're experiencing when we do experience something like a ghost or even a religious visitation, something like Fatima or the sightings of Mary. How are these things being processed by the brain, and what role does our perception play in understanding those processes?
And just circling back, you mentioned folklore. I mean, I've always thought about the idea of doppelgangers. The doppelgangers of encountering versions of ourselves, depending on the culture. It's either a dark messenger, or it's just sort of a blip in time. Seeing dad come home and go up the steps a few minutes before dad comes home, and it goes up the steps. These are essentially very similar. These are early ideas of these travelers in a way, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Have you ever seen a doppelganger of yours, Aaron?
Not of mine. I have been in situations where I saw a doppelganger of someone else, and it was indeed very strange. Have you?
So twice. One was just on television. I was reading a book and I had television on, and all of a sudden I heard my voice on the TV, and I looked up on the TV and it was cutting away, but it was me in Florida talking to someone about a hurricane, and my mind just fried. This was pre-internet, so I couldn't go back and find the clip. But it's interesting when I think about the second one, which is I have a very strange recollection of when I was in like third or fourth grade. I fell off a swing, and the swing hit me in the head. But right before it hit me in the head, I was kind of tugged. There were adults on the playground too, but this adult tugged me. And when I think back now, it was this bald man who was older, and I think he kind of saved me from being more hurt than I was. And as I get older and as I have lost my hair, I'm coming to realize that perhaps that was me that helped me when I fell off that swing.
Isn't that the Twilight Zone episode? Where the guy goes back to his old town
Oh,
and he
walking
encounters.
distance.
Yeah. Although he's meddling with things and trying to interact with his younger self when he actually causes an injury to himself.
And I'm not one to do that. People have asked me before if I could travel through time, what would I go? What would I change? And I really wouldn't want to change anything. I'm pretty satisfied with the person that I am. I think if anything, I would just like to go back and watch something like my father meet my mother for the first time, or watch me creepily fall in love for the first time.
So you would so you would follow sort of the Doc Brown idea of non-engagement.
Yes, and to go back to Asimov for a second, Asimov used to talk about this interwoven tapestry of timelines and universes, and he would say that, you know, if you had a rug stretched out in front of you, you know, you actually could go in and change, you know, something. You could snip one of those threads, but the rug isn't going to fall apart.
Yeah.
You would have to massively go in and make immense changes to the timeline for something to be noticeably different.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a Doctor Who idea as well, that there are just sort of moments that in time that are especially significant, that they're staples that hold things together. And it's interesting within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So in Endgame, of course, they travel through time and they kind of dismiss the, you know, they discuss Back to the Future, the idea that if you go back, you're creating a separate timeline. They kind of dismiss that and say you just go back and you can kind of pop in and out as long as you're popping in and out at the precise times. Is that uh, which kind of idea do you kind of go with this?
You
Do
know, I
you?
think especially with the Marvel universe doing that, I thought it was interesting that they decided to go into the kind of quantum realm beyond this reality.
Mhm.
And they chose to stay in this reality because if they're going into the quantum realm, then they're having access to other realities. And if they were all about just saving theirs, then you just don't worry about the timeline, just pop into another reality, steal the gems, and come back to this one, and, you know, kind of screw that other reality, let it fall apart. We're worried
Mhm.
about ours. So I think it's interesting that they took the choice to say, oh, we're going back into our own reality and not interacting, when looking at the suffering they had gone through, uh, you would think that they would just say, like, all bets are off. Our reality is prime. Let's just go into another one that doesn't seem like it's so great, and don't worry about it. I mean, that actually happened on an episode of Next Generation. I don't know how many people remember this, but all of a sudden these enterprises started showing up, and on screen is Riker in command of the Enterprise, and it's being blown to bits because there's a giant war going on in his universe, in his reality. And Picard's like, nope, send him back. Like, they don't even try to help. They're like, nope, you're out of here.
Yeah, the sorry, I was getting quite loud. Yeah, it's a some sort of truck moving background. It's the I think that's, yeah, I think that's a good point too. And they do try to preserve their own timeline. But with that said, with Spider-Man, I have not seen it yet, so I can't even give you any spoilers. But it would seem like, based on the promotional material, we are going to be, of course, getting Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. We're getting Doc Ock. Looks like Sandman and Electro and Lizard are going to be in this. And the prevailing idea, the theory, is that we're going to get both the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. Now, I don't know. Let me just say, I don't know. I'm just going off of what everybody assumes is going to be happening. But these are different versions of this similar character. So, what do you think about that? And do you think that it is that we do have these other universes where there is a similar John Tenney, but not quite the the one with the goatee, or the
Well, that's kind of, we're back to where we actually kind of started, which was when you allow for one more, or when you allow for 10 more, you have to start allowing for an infinite variety. And an infinite variety means an infinite variety. I mean, that means that there's a universe where you and I
Mhm.
are talking, and everything in the universe is exactly the same, except for the fact that, like, one of the pages of my books is behind me is slightly bent, and then there's another one where it's slightly more bent. And I mean, at that amount of variation, because it's an infinite amount of possibilities, it also means that there's a universe where you and I are the same, except we're rabbits talking to each other.
Mhm.
uh, so, you know, it's one of those things with Spider-Man. And what I assume is the Doctor Strange movie. Like they are going into multiple different realities in the universes. They're going into this like larger megaverse, omniverse, right? And that's interesting to me too, especially because scientifically, you also have to look at like, well, what are the variations of those universes? Because when they start to touch, like if you go into another reality that gravity is slightly different than ours, like what effect is that going to have on ours when all of a sudden there are two laws of gravity instead of one? Uh, which one are they going to fight for dominance? Is it just going to be completely off the rails? So I don't think Spider-Man will touch so much on that, but it might. I mean, maybe that's why in the trailer for Spider-Man, you see, grounds folding in and people falling up and out and over. So, the science itself inside the Spider-Man universe might be changing as well.
I thought Loki did a really nice job with the idea of the variants, that it was one Loki appearing in different ways. And that kind of ties into potentially these Peter Parkers that look different. But for me, I absolutely love Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, because this is introducing the idea of the multiverse, and yet that one spider is going to bite different people, or it's a different spider biting different people, and that it almost suggests that there is this need across universes for certain characters or certain certain archetypes, that there needs to be a Spider-Man everywhere.
Yeah, and that's always been interesting too. Are there going to be repeating patterns like the spider always biting someone? But then again, when you come into an infinite variety, you obviously are going to have to say like, well, have to be, since it's infinitesimal and since it goes on in every direction in every way, there are going to be universes where it doesn't happen or where the effects are horrible. I think Marvel did a comic book about that called Ruins, where you see Peter Parker gets bitten by a spider, but he just gets radioactive poisoning blood and dies. Like that's one of the possibilities of being bitten by a radioactive spider.
Yeah. I'm going to show this. This explains mall Santas. Night Sky 66, you joke, and yet I know for a fact that Tenney and I can go down a whole other rabbit hole of Santa. Maybe we're already close to Christmas, I guess, but I don't know. Do you have a minute? Do you want to just take a brief detour into Santa and give me thoughts on Santa?
I mean, if human beings collectively can create something all by thinking of the same thing at the same time, there are millions of children thinking about Santa Claus on one night and forming a thought form, perhaps forcing an actual Santa Claus into reality. Santa Claus as the ultimate egregore, the combined longings, lovings, and ideas of children manifested into our reality. And sometimes you do see very strange pictures that might look like Santa Claus or reindeer flying in the sky.
Yeah. I mean, something I often say is Santa exists more than most of the people that I even interact with on Twitter or might follow me on Twitter. Like, I know what Santa looks like. I know what he does for a job. I know where he lives. I know who he's married to. He's I sent letters to him as a child and were encouraged to send letters to him by my parents. So, as far as someone that fully exists, Santa.
He ate the cookies that I put out for him.
Exactly. He took the carrots for the reindeer too from my hood. But is there a comic? Well, okay. Before I want to ask another question about Spider-Man, but like anything you would like to see with No Way Home, as both a nerd and researcher of the weird, anything you want to see out of Spider-Man No Way Home?
No, I'm just excited to see it. I have a slightly long history with Spider-Man. Spider-Man again as someone you meet as a child. I met Spider-Man at 7-Eleven when I was 8 years old. He was there for Spider-Man Slurpee cups, and it was the first costumed character I ever met. In later life, a friend of mine revealed that he had played the part of Spider-Man on the Electric Company, which I had watched growing up.
Wow.
That was a mind blower when I found that out. So Spider-Man, no matter what happens, uh, I, I want to see it, and I'll be happy to see it.
Yeah, Spider-Man is my favorite superhero, and for kind of the same reason or similar reason to yours. I remember I already loved him, and I remember him from the electric factory,
Electric
and
Company.
and he didn't speak in that, just in word bubbles, I
Yep.
guess. But the for me, it was at like some state fair, the guy Spider-Man standing there taking Polaroid photos with kids that would then be put into a nice little decorated sleeve. And when I went up to take a picture with Spider-Man, I said, "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone you're really Peter Parker." And he's like, "Shh, thanks, kid. All right, let's shoot some webs." And we did and the fact that I remember that, yes, I have a long history
I
with
wasn't
Spider-Man.
I wasn't allowed to read Spider-Man for about a year, Spider-Man comics for about a year, because uh, we had a very narrow hallway in the house I grew up in, and I would put my legs and my hands in the hallway, and I would shimmy up the walls like Spider-Man, and my head hit this light fixture that my mother had gotten for Christmas, and I broke it. And so for like a year, my parents wouldn't let me read Spider-Man.
I Spider-Man was a role model for me because I was a short kid. I still am a short guy, and it taught me to climb and scramble and everything all over everything. Someone else wants to know before we wrap this up: is there another comic book or storyline you would like to see get a multiverse treatment? We'll say get the multiverse treatment, or also adapt it into perhaps a movie. Maybe that's what you mean. But yeah,
This has always been it's one of those passions of my childhood. Is I want a movie, and it would have to be with multiple realities. It would have to be with multiple universes because of the dire wraiths who exist in this universe. But I would love to see some type of multiversal cosmic movie of Rom the Space Knight.
wow. Yeah. I think Rom had some interesting rights issues for a while because
Oh
it
yeah, it still
was
does. Hasbro, I
yeah,
think, still owns
Hasbro.
it. Yeah.
But seems like they could probably figure that out. Why do you think there is this mainstream, obviously, as you said, like pop culture has always been talking about the multiverse and in one form or the other calling it different things, but now we are seeing the MCU, Marvel, and Sony lean into this heavily. We have this Flash movie on the way that kind of takes elements from Flashpoint, but we get the Michael Keaton Batman and a Ben Affleck Batman, and these are things that studios would not have even touched years ago. I think, not at this level, and it seems like something that fans are ready for. Has there been a change? Has everybody is this kind of a new acceptance? And if so, why do you think?
I think that humans have always had this longing for fantasy realities where things are stranger but better, perhaps, to escape the current reality we seem to all be sharing. And, whether it's something like even Fantasy Island back in the 70s, you could go to this place and your dreams could come true. Maybe they weren't working out the way then you appreciated your reality at the end that you were actually existing in. And I think that we just live in a time of such information overload, and there's so much going on in our day-to-day lives. Like the market for people giving them a chance to escape into a different universe has become very palatable to a very large population.
Yeah. And someone said that they could listen to us talk all day long. I appreciate this.
Thanks.
And it is a fun. It's great talking to you. Weirdness Wednesdays with Aaron and John. It's that weird that it happens on a Tuesday, in fact.
Right?
um, and
Unless that
and
person is watching on a Wednesday,
right.
tomorrow, oh shit, it's happening.
It's already happening. And then who is your favorite? Well, okay, you said Electric Company, but who is your favorite on-screen Spider-Man and why? Especially if we might be getting multiples, except for Nick Holland, right? Nick. Nicholas Hammond, I don't think is going to be making an appearance from the 70s Spider-Man. But
No.
who's your favorite on-camera
I think,
Spider-Man?
in all honesty, I think my favorite Spider-Man is Tom Holland. There's
Yeah.
something about his lankiness. There's something about the way he plays nerdy and geeky and is happy to be playing nerdy and geeky that I find very appealing in Peter Parker.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I will say when they started doing the live action movies, I really wanted it to be because I always grew up with Spider-Man. He was already well into his 20s, and shortly after, like, married MJ. I was always into the somewhat more grown-up Spider-Man, but I do like Tom Holland in high school as Spider-Man. Although, I'd be okay if he got married to MJ again. I mean, that's a whole other storyline,
Right?
which is how we got to No Way Home, right? Like
Yeah.
wiping out. That was Brand New Day.
Yes.
I think so. And he
Yeah.
made a deal with the devil, or Mephisto, right? I think
Right.
that's
Who
how
exists
that.
in a different dimension.
Yeah, who exists in a different dimension. Weird. I love it. I love it. Well, John EL Tenney, John, before we let you go, how can everyone find you and support all the awesome and weird things that you do?
My Twitter, Instagram is just John EL Tenney. Every week I do a podcast called What's Up Weirdo, which is just me talking on the phone to my friend Jessica about random stuff. Sometimes like this, sometimes it's just about what we're watching on television. And that can be found at whatsupweirdo.com or on all your podcast listening services.
All right, wherever you listen to fine podcasts. And I will say, we're going to be back here on Thursday, December 16th at 1:30 p.m. with Scott Snyder, the comic book writer. He has a couple horror-themed Comixology originals. We Have Demons and Night of the Ghoul, and we're going to be chatting with Scott. He is a great guy. Maybe we'll get in some multiverse questions for him as well. And you can find me at Aaron Sagers on Twitter, Instagram. You can check out the Patreon I do and my very slow to update podcast, Nightmerica. But also, if you like this content, I mean, I know I do. I like nerding out with John and as Den of Geek said, like, keep flagging the word weirdo. I enjoy this, so I hope you guys do come back and demand more of this kind of content so we can keep being weird. So wherever you are in the world, whichever timeline or universe you're in, keep it spooky and stay weird.